Donc, bonjour à toutes et à tous et bienvenue aujourd'hui. Nous sommes
Good
très contents.
afternoon, everyone. Welcome. This is a pleasure to see you so numerous today to talk about the topic of this revised mining code and to talk about the challenges that remain to be addressed for its full implementation. COVID-19 outbreak started in March 2020, and measures need to be put in place to prevent the spread of COVID-19. We will also discuss about it as they have significant impact not only on the lives and human rights of local mining communities, but also on the implementation of the revised mining code. Today, we are meeting in the framework of a side event organized in parallel to the 45th session of the Human Rights Council. This event is organized by 4 organizations active in particular in the protection and defense of human rights and in advocacy for human rights. They are Franciscans International. Franciscans International is an international NGO active in human rights advocacy at the United Nations. The second organization is Dominicans for Justice and Peace. This is a faith-based, non-governmental, non-profit organization representing the Dominican order at the United Nations. It aims, among other things, to promote and defend human rights and to bring justice to those whose rights have been violated. Third organization, Justice and Peace Commission. This is a Belgian NGO that raises awareness and challenges citizens, educational actors, but also political leaders on issues of conflict, democracy, and environment. And finally, fourth organization, EURAC, the European Network for Central Africa, which brings together 36 European civil society organizations and advocates for strong, coherent, and sustainable commitment by the EU and its member states in the DRC, but also in Burundi and Rwanda. I am myself Diane Crétin, Program Manager at Swiss Catholic Lenten Fund, the Swiss Catholic Relief Organization. We are working with many countries from the Global South, including DRC. Before getting to the heart of the matter, I would like to give some details about the modalities of this side event. We'll have an exchange during 90 minutes. 5 speakers will take the floor to present their research and their work. We will also have 2 additional experts that will complement and enrich the talks of our 5 speakers. As members of the audience, you will have the opportunity to ask questions and make comments, whether in English or French. As we anticipate that the internet connection will be unstable at some times, we'll only take written questions and comments. So feel free to use the conversation or comment button on Zoom. Please also indicate your name and whether your question is specifically dedicated to one of our speakers. Mr. Michael Repelin, African Program Coordinator for Franciscans International, and Ms. Laurence Blatmer, Program Coordinator for Dominicans for Justice and Peace, will take up these questions during the second part of the side event with me. Please also note that this side event will be recorded. So much for the practical information. Now let's get to the heart of the matter. In 2018, a new mining code was adopted in Congo. It replaces the previous mining code of 2002, which for 15 years gave pride of place for foreign investors and probably contributed to the development of the mining industry in Congo. Unfortunately, the profusion of copper, cobalt, coltan, gold, and diamonds did not necessarily benefit the local population. With the new mining code of 2018, which was approved under the presidency of Joseph Kabila, the level of taxation of companies exploiting so-called strategic minerals, such as cobalt, has greatly increased. Other binding measures for mining companies have been set. Compared to the previous mining code, It could be estimated that the new code should bring various improvements for the benefit of the Congolese population, and in particular to the benefit of communities directly impacted by the mining industry. During this side event, we will first seek to get an overview of the current human rights situations with regards to the mining activities in different regions of Eastern Congo in particular. We will also examine the impact that COVID-19 had on the living conditions of those local communities over the past few months. To discuss this, we have the pleasure to welcome Mr. Emmanuel Umpula, then Sister Célestine Sumanende, and finally Mr. Gilbert Dhego. Then, we will focus more specifically on the content of the mining code and also on the gaps and even contradictions that we can find in this code, despite the advances and progress it represents. To talk about all those legal issues, we will have the pleasure to welcome Fabien Mayani, who will tell us more about that. Finally, we will also examine the international dimension of the Congolese mining issue through the intervention of Mr. Abdoul Aziz Thioye, who is part of the United Nations Joint Human Rights Office. Indeed, the mining issue is one of the vectors of good political governance of the country, and it is key to consider. The mining industry, whether large-scale or small-scale mining industry, represents more than 1/3 of the revenues. This is why this is such a key, more than 30% of the gross domestic product. And this is why we will have to keep an eye on it. To begin, we are pleased to welcome Mr. Emmanuel Umpula, Executive Director of the Lubumbashi-based organization African Resource Watch, AFREWATCH. AFREWATCH was created in 2013. It operates in the natural resources sector, particularly mining. Since its creation, the organization has accompanied communities living around mining companies in the provinces of Lualaba and Haut-Katanga, where copper cobalt are mined. My question for you, Emmanuel, is about the status of implementation of the revised mining code in these regions of Lualaba and Haut-Katanga. In addition, we would like to hear from you on the evolution of the last few months and how the measures taken to contain and stop COVID-19 pandemic have impacted the activities in the production chain. Emmanuel, you have the floor. Can you hear me, Emmanuel?
Ok. Merci beaucoup pour nous avoir invité.
Yes, I hear you. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Pendant ces temps, alors je vais présenter je vais commencer par dire que
First,
le Congo a révisé le code minier.
let me say that Congo revised the mining code in March 2018.
C'est après un constat amer selon lequel les minéraux
Because
ne profitaient pas
they realized that mining was not benefiting to the local communities at all.
qui ont poussé l'État congolais
And this is one of the 10 reasons that led the Congolese state,
l'État congolais, mais aussi tous les acteurs
but also all the different stakeholders that were involved in the mining industry to revise this code. The goal was to bring a balance between the abundance of natural resources and the poverty of local communities. During the revision process, many people were included. It was a participative and inclusive process, even if there were some issues at some point. But globally speaking, it was inclusive and participative. Civil society was included, just like the Congolese authorities and the mining companies. Civil society's proposals were taken into account, which was positive. We worked with the civil society in order to revise the mining code. Its role was key, and it managed to find agreements between the Congolese authorities and the mining companies. Now, please, let me highlight some of the landmarks of that mining code. And let me tell you how it is innovative. First, it tackles the issue of community development. There are many new things, obviously, in the mining code. I will just tackle a few topics. Such as specific requirements and specifications and a minimum allocation for local communities. Then the mining code includes the issues of transparency and good governance. The aim is to implement procurement for companies. The issue of real ownership has been included as well. Then companies must publish every 3 months their turnover. And we did all that in order to better manage the natural resources and to make sure that citizens could get access to the information. Citizens wanted to have a look on what was happening in their land, and this is why we included such things in the mining code. Moreover, in the mining code, now, Congolese can take action, but I'll get back to that later on. Then, subcontracting was integrated. There's a part of this mining code about subcontracting and outsourcing. And it is key because if we want to promote local economy, we need to take into account outsourcing and subcontracting. Then taxation was changed in this mining code. And as you know, there were numerous debates on those issues. So these are the main landmarks, but we can get back to that later on. Now, please, let me tell you a bit more about the implementation and enforcement of the mining code. I must say that it is not fully enforced. This revised mining code brought a lot of hope, but so far it has not been fully enforced. There are some difficulties. Things were not easy on the ground because of the prices. Prices of cobalt, for instance, went down, and this did not ease the situation. If the costs of metals are at 90% or $90,000, unfortunately, there are some sound issues with Emmanuel. The interpreter cannot hear him anymore. Emmanuel, can you still hear us? It seems that we are losing you. We are losing your connection. Maybe you should switch off your camera so that we can hear your voice. You would have more bandwidth.
Beaucoup, que maintenant c'est 30 000 dollars, donc c'est des revenus comme c'était prévu. Il y a, par exemple, pour les communautés locales, on ne parvient pas.
Unfortunately, the sound of Emmanuel is too poor, and the interpreter cannot hear him anymore. Sorry about those technical issues. Unfortunately, we lost Emmanuel. Yes, I'm here. I'm here, sorry. I have some issues with my internet connection. As I was saying, there are some issues when it comes to the enforcement of the mining code. Civil society integrated this mining code. It has not been fully taken into account by everyone. We would like to spread it to raise awareness about the mining code. Indeed, on the field, we realized that decision makers and people who are supposed to enforce the mining code are facing difficulties. For instance, regarding the specifications and requirements. Nowadays, it is difficult for companies to know how to implement the mining code. Then there's a lack of respect of some provisions of the mining code. Some of the provisions are not respected. So there's a law enforcement issue, and this can explain the situation on the ground. Regarding community development, we can welcome the improvement. Some local communities are getting some redress and compensation. This is something good. However, it is not the case everywhere. In the Haut-Katanga region, for instance, there have been promises, some funds have been received, so this is something good. There's an improvement. Once companies will have signed some specifications and requirements with the civil society, things could improve, and we can observe, for instance, some positive changes. This is why we are asking companies and Congolese authorities to implement such measures that are included in the mining code. Regarding COVID-19, I must say that Congo is not an isolated country. Just like all the other countries, Congo was hit by the COVID-19 pandemic. In March, the authorities had to react to such a situation. In March, we didn't have a lot of cases of COVID-19. or we didn't have a lot of COVID-19 patients, but we still took action. President implemented several measures, barrier measures in some provinces, and called a sanitary emergency in order to combat COVID-19. Companies had to react as well, to adapt to those measures.
Je suis absolument désolée. On va gentiment conclure votre présentation et on reviendra peut-être encore tout à l'heure sur les mesures qui ont été en lien avec, avec le Covid-19, si cela vous va. Je vous remercie vraiment pour votre présentation qui a ouvert ce side event.
Unfortunately, we have to give you the floor. Thank you very much for taking the floor.
Avec les mesures de prévention contre le Covid-19.
And thank you for telling us about the different measures that have been taken.
Qui est sœur Célestine Sumanende. On a vu la question des droits humains au Lualaba et au Katanga ont été brièvement abordées.
So we had the issue of human rights to Okatanga, Katanga and Walaba, and also the violation on the workers' rights that were occurred during the lockdown. So we'll get back to these cases later on. I will give the floor to Sir Célestine Sumanende, Sister Célestine Sumanende, who's been the sister in charge of the sisters in the province of UniUélé in the northeast of the country. Sister Célestine, you are a project director at the UniUélé University and a Dominican Commission member on mining resources. Recently, at the beginning of September, your working group has paid visits to the Watsa and Farage regions, where they're using gold and mining gold to understand the human situation, the human rights situation there. Your team also documented the crisis that occurred a few days before in Watsa between artisanal miners and the Tribali gold mine company. Sister, you work on the field and your experience are great. So what do you think the human rights situation is like in the region and in the sector? And what are the causes of the current tensions? Sister, you have the floor. Well, thank you, Diane, for inviting us to this very important meeting. So our team worked on the field, like you said. We provided work there and we collected data on human rights and the respect of human rights in the mining sector. First, I have to say that in our province, not only artisanal workers, small workers, there is a big company, a large company, a mining company, which is providing industrial mining activities there. And then we have semi-industries there too. But also, like I said, small ones, small people who got together, regrouped to create a cooperative company, for example, which is licensed by the state of Congo, and other workers are not in a cooperative company. So what we saw on the field is the following. The large company and the semi-industrial company have to work with miners. The artisanal workers work in co-ops. They have land that they're working on, specific areas that they're working on. But artisanal workers, which are not part of a co-op, are working in a more scattered fashion. They don't have specific plots of land to do their work. What we also noticed is that in some areas where you have artisanal miners, you find pregnant women and children at work. And of course, they work in very harsh conditions, especially when it comes to children. They're not working for themselves. They're working for other people. They just get the scraps of what's left just to survive, and this is what they need to have their families, to support their families. So this is what we observed there in our province in the Congo. So the consequence of that was that some people have tried to work alone, but they don't have land or a specific area to mine, to dig, and they end up working on other people's land. There was an incident in July in Durba, in Wachamuke. Well, at the time, what happened is that the artisanal workers who are not part of a co-op, they wanted to work on an estate which is covered by the large company. So the people working in the co-op don't actually have enough money either to do what they need to do. So they don't have enough money to start their work. And so they should be able to work, and they're not working with great organization because they are still in a co-op, but they're not well organized. And so here we need to see how we repay those fees. When it comes to the fees, this is not something which is well covered in the rules, in the regulations on the mining accounts. So it's quite confusing. Some local leaders may think that this money is theirs, it belongs to them. So they want to use it as they wish. Additionally, we see that there's a lack of communication on the mining code. So for the people working in the field, we see that many of them do not actually know the different provisions of the mining code. So the consequence is that there is a insecurity. So people don't feel secure, safe, because the company says it will pay all the cost to the state of Congo, to the authorities, and so they should be able to enjoy the land peacefully because they pay the fees and the license. However, other people want to supposedly bother them on their estate. This is why this big company has called upon the local or provincial authorities to make sure that they would secure the land, including the mines. So when the team coming from the provincial authorities went to the field to secure the land and speak to the population, well, the population reacted. They disagreed. You know, all those who work on their own, who don't have their own specific area from digging, well, just looking for ways to work and places to work to survive eventually. And so part of the population actually reacted and protested. Unfortunately. And they said that since they were born, this has been their only work. So taking this work away from them means killing them. So there were problems also with the police there, and every time it became violent between the government's authorities and the workers on the field, because people actually rose against the authorities. So in addition to this, you have issues between the different workers, independent workers. They want to render justice on their own. And to give you an example, something happened in one area, a mining area around Makaro. And what happened there is that one person rendered justice for himself, and he punished a 15-year-old who used some land there, and he actually whipped him. He whipped the child until the child actually passed away. So these are things that occur there on the field, and it's a problem when it comes to human rights and the respect of human rights in the mining areas of the province. Thank you for your attention.
Un grand merci, Sœur Célestine.
Well, thank you, Sister Célestine, for these explanations and for us to understand the difficulties on when it comes to artisanal mining, which should be combined with industrial mining. We understand that the working conditions for miners are precarious, very problematic, and it is in harsh contrast with the wealth that can be extracted from the mines. So we'll get back to this later this afternoon and speak again on industrial and artisanal mining that should learn to live together. Sister Célestine, thank you for this testimony. We'll move on now with Gilbert Dhego, who's a project officer, but also an assistant to the Justice and Peace Coordination at Caritas for the Diocese of Goma. He's been long fighting for the rights of local miners and local communities' rights in the DRC. Mr. Dhego is also an expert in mediation and conflict mediation between mining companies and local people. Mr. Dhego, we know that you still are facing a lot of challenges when it comes to the execution of the mining code, which was promulgated in 2018. So what do you think is the main difficulty when it comes to executing the mining code in North Kivu? And did COVID-19 worsen the situation in the mining area in your region? Sir, you have the floor. All right. Can you hear me? Yes, we do hear you. I'd like to thank the organizers of this online event for giving us a possibility to speak today and explain the difficulties that we have when it comes to executing the revised mining code in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. So COVID-19 had an impact also on all mining sectors in the east of the DRC, but especially in the Walikale territory, where the main city Goma has been affected, where that's an area where we have a lot of artisanal miners. The previous speakers have explained what has been done when it comes to the revised mining code and its execution. Well, we believe that the main difficulty when it comes to implementing the code is actually the lack of knowledge. You know that everybody should know the law. However, you should tell people there is a law. People should be made aware that there's a law that should be respected. All stakeholders should actually be told that there's a law in the mining sector. It can be an industry or small workers. The mining code is not well known enough, or it's not enough known by people. So people will keep working as they used to. They keep behaving as if there was no revision of the code. So the main recommendation would be that the code should be disseminated broadly. It's not just a mining code, because a mining code gives you the main guidelines, but you also have other measures, executing measures in the mining code that should be also better known. Now, this comes back to the state of Congo. This is the main authority that should be in charge of disseminating information about the code. Civil society organizations like Caritas and others, NGOs, try to make people learn about the code and about the regulations. This, what they do is still limited, because these organizations can only work where they're supposed to. So we ask for more communication on this. We ask that the Congolese state provides the necessary means for that. They should focus on a private-public partnership, maybe to communicate more on the mining code. It should become mandatory to actually communicate about the code and for people to know it. Because if the code is well respected, it will enable the mining sector to become an engine for the development of the Congolese people. So as I said, it is necessary to know that there's a code, mining code. This is what we see the most. Even you should even communicate about it in specialized services of the state. Even the mining police, some departments and offices, they don't even know that there's a code, or they don't even have a copy of the code. And so NGOs, civil society organizations, try to make do with what they have to equip them. And it's not normal. So these people need capacity building. They need education on the code, on the revised code, because we see there's too much lack of knowledge in the field, even in co-ops among single workers. So there's a lot of work to be done when it comes to educating these people about the mining code. They really need to learn about what's going on with the mining code so that they finally respect it, and so that we make sure that the mining sector becomes the true engine of development of Congo. So like I said, this lack of knowledge makes it that some people become miners, although they cannot have a mining activity. So what can they do? Because they don't even know they're not allowed to go mining. So they just do it because they need it. So again, I would like to get back to what Sister Célestine said. You have the fees, types of taxation, licenses, all this must be explained clearly. This should be explained to cooperative companies members, to different individuals. They should know the management manual, how to manage the fees, the payment of the fees, like Sister said. There are many things, the different local entities get money, and the authorities, when they get the money, they believe it's theirs. It's for them to use. So since there is no clear structure to run all that and manage that money, they keep the money and they believe it's for them. But the money should be used to support the development of the entities, on the places there. So we need to educate them too. Additionally, when it comes to the difficulties to implement the code, co-ops have to work on lists of specifications that will contribute to development of their environment where they are. You have the case of Walikale. Well, these co-ops there have no money. So since the co-op members have no money, well, they cannot sign and approve agreements, but the law is there. So what's the law doing? You see, so the mining code should be fully implemented. If you take Walikale, Alpha Mine is the only mining company that's able to pay the fees of the decentralized local authority. But like I said, the problem comes with the rational use of that money, of those fees.
Une vue d'ensemble de la situation à cause du Covid au Nord Kivu.
Mr. Dhego, could you tell us a bit more about the COVID-19 situation? Yes, of course. We have a sanitary emergency that has been announced. We stopped movements from one city to another. We had confinement and lockdown in the city of Goma, for instance, and this measure paralyzed the mining industry, especially the artisanal small-scale mining. Economic operators that were going to Walikale, for instance, and that were mining at a small scale were stuck. They were blocked. They couldn't move anymore. And this had huge impacts on small-scale mining. Those economic operators, they were selling goods in Walikale. The money was used to buy minerals, and they had to sell them back. That's what they were doing before, but when the borders got closed, those activities were completely stopped. And this had a huge impact on the lives of artisanal miners and of all those local communities. During the most strictest period of lockdown, there were no small-scale mining activities at all. This industry suffered a lot from the lockdown, given that this is the only source of revenues for several local communities. We had, in a way, ghost cities because there were no movements and no money. This is what the local communities near Walikale have been saying. There's been a drop in the activities, in the mining activities, and there was a drop in revenues because economic operators were not buying minerals anymore because of this COVID-19 crisis. Thank you very much, Mr. Dhego. We will conclude with this. Thank you for your presentation. That gives us a better overview on what is happening in Walikale and Kivu Lake. We realize how important civil society is to raise awareness of local communities about the legislation, especially in the areas where the authorities are not active enough. Thank you as well for the information and feedback you gave us about the region of Walikale and the impact of the different measures that have been implemented in order to fight COVID-19. Thank you for your presentation as well. Please let me remind you that you have the possibility to ask questions. Just click on the Q&A button in Zoom. Feel free to write in English or French. Please state your name, your question, obviously, and who you are asking it to. In spite of the progress made in the mining legislation, in view of the three interventions we've just heard, we note many gaps and contradictions in the implementation of these laws, and we are pleased to count on Mr. Fabien Mayani to address these issues. Mr. Mayani, for more than 15 years, you've been a researcher and a human rights defender. You are a specialist in governance of extractive resources, but also on issues of access to justice for the most vulnerable groups. In addition, you are in charge of the Caritas Center's Extractive Industries Governance Program. You're also the author of a recent report published by Cordaid in June 2020, entitled 2 Years After the Revision of the Mining Code, Local Communities Waiting for Social Benefits. You're also a jurist and attorney at the Lubumbashi Bar, and you've been among civil society actors that have monitored and participated in the process of reforming the DRC's mining legislation. My question to you is, what is your assessment of the weakness in the legislation relating to mining, and what concrete solutions do you think need to be considered? Mr. Mayani, you have the floor. Well, thank you very much for giving me the floor. Thank you for this opportunity to talk about the mining industry and the issues that local communities are facing on the ground. Let me start by a state of play. As the previous speakers said, a new mining code has been adopted, but it's not fully enforced. Emmanuel mentioned some of the provisions that have not been applied yet, and this is a fact. This is what we notice on the ground. Then, there's a lack of interest to human rights issues in the mining industry and more generally speaking in the DRC, especially from the government. Indeed, government focus rather on taxation and less on human rights. The enforcement of the provisions on human rights are not monitored. As a consequence, poverty is still visible in the mining areas, despite the fact that the revised mining code aimed at solving those poverty issues in the mining areas. Why are we facing such a situation? Previous speakers mentioned the main issues that we are facing, and I tried to highlight and divide those obstacles in two categories. The first category is about legal and regulatory problems. There are, for instance, some contradictions between the revised law and its enforcement. If you read the law and the mining code, you will notice contradictions. This is why 2 years after the adoption of this mining code, the mining code is still not applied and enforced by companies. So there are new principles that have been adopted in the mining code, but there are contradictions with the law. Second, the regulatory framework is ambiguous and not complete. Sister Célestine talked about the funds, the 15 funds of mining royalties, for instance. The way they have to be used has not been clarified. It is not said how those funds should be redistributed by the different communities that are impacted by one mining project, for instance. So it's ambiguous and unfinished. Then there's a second category of obstacles, the lack of governance. There is a weak governance. Even when the mining code is clear, the state authorities are not controlling the enforcement of the mining code. Emmanuel talked about some lists of specifications and requirements. Sometimes those requirements are clear, they are agreements, and what we realize is that communities sign those agreements and then the state is not enforcing them and monitoring the agreements. And as I was saying, the Congolese government is more interested in taxation than the respect of human rights. And we notice as well that in mining companies, there's a lack of culture of respect of human rights. As you know, the responsibilities of companies have the responsibility to respect human rights. They have to protect and defend human rights. But the fact is that companies are taking advantage of the lack of governance to disrespect and violate human rights. In some regions where they exploit cobalt, some mining companies keep expelling people and communities, whereas in the mining code, there's a procedure that has been defined on how to deport and reinstall communities. So what are the possibilities that we have? Well, there are some potential solutions. First of all, the government must adopt and enforce all the remaining measures. Civil society has identified the measures that have to be enforced and those that have to be corrected in order to align and streamline the law and mining code. Then, as previous speakers said, we have to disseminate the mining code as it has been revised, and we need to make it more popular. What I mean by that is that we have to disseminate and popularize that mining code, and especially the issues of human rights. We must explain local communities that they have rights and that they should defend them. Then I think the local authorities should implement local committees for the human rights protection and development. Those committees are mentioned in the mining code. They will have to tackle the issues of human rights and development. Those committees, those local committees, have not been created yet. If we set local committees that are aware about the mining code, this could help the solution. Fourth potential solution, we have to ensure the effective monitoring of the enforcement of the mining code and the management of funds and opportunities dedicated to local development. Mr. Dhego and Sister Célestine talked about the way to use the 15% of funds of mining royalties. If there's no control, it won't work. There's no clarity at the moment on how they should be used, and we can question the efficiency of the way these funds are used. This leads to numerous issues, and we have to solve that problem. Then, as he said, a report was published in June 2020. It was about the assessment of the revised mining codes 2 years after its adoption in 2018. This report highlighted several issues, including those I mentioned. For instance, some measures have not been enforced and are not respected. There's an issue with the funds that are redistributed to local communities. There's an issue with the list of specifications and the agreements. So in this report, you have an inventory, a practical inventory of the main issues that have been identified with regards to the enforcement of the revised mining code. This report is available on the Cordaid website. If you want to know more about the assessment of this revised mining code, feel free to go and have a look at this report. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Mayani, for this presentation that gives us a better overview of the legal and political issues regarding the mining industry. Thank you for those potential solutions that you have identified as well. To conclude this roundtable or tour de table of speakers, and because the previous presentations offered essentially national insights, it is relevant to take a step back to examine the role of the international community, and in particular the United Nations. To discuss this, we have the chance to welcome Mr. Abdoul Aziz Thioye, who is the director of the United Nations Joint Office in the DRC, who will tell us a bit more about the human rights situations in the DRC. Mr. Thioye, as you well know, the human rights situations in the DRC is discussed under item 10 at each session of the HRC in Geneva since 2015, and since 2013, a resolution on technical assistance is voted on every year. In your opinion, how can the Human Rights Council and the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights support the DRC in strengthening the protection of human rights in the mining sector? Mr. Thioye, you have the floor. Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Can you see me? Can you hear me? Well, we do not see you and we can hear you, but not very loud. Okay, let me try to increase the sound. Can you hear me better? Yes, slightly. Well, a bit more. Okay, now you hear me, but I don't understand why you cannot see me. Anyway, in the meantime, there we go. There we go. You have the floor, Mr. Thioye. First of all, I'd like to apologize. Indeed, I had another video conference, another important one, on human rights. As you know, the United Nations are supporting and defending human rights in the DRC. And this other video conference I had was about the enforcement of human rights across the world. And President said, took the floor yesterday about the situation of human rights, and he has been clear. He's asking for the support of the international community, especially with regards to the governance of the mining industry, governance of the supply chains, and with regards to the illegal exploitation of natural resources that lead to conflicts in the DRC. And you were right to say that since 2013, the Human Rights Council has been voting resolution under item 10 at each session in Geneva about the human rights situation in the DRC. Just like the Security Council resolutions are guiding the action of the United Nations, the actions and the resolutions taken under item 10 of the Human Rights Council session guide our actions with regards to human rights. We are often focusing on what are the causes, the roots of the conflicts, and also on the consequences, but today we are focusing more on the root causes of the conflicts. Indeed, there have been improvement in the situation since 2018, since there was a change in power in 2018. However, some trends led us back to the situation we had in 2015. There are violations of human rights due to conflicts, especially in eastern Congo. All the regions involved are regions where we are exploiting natural resources and minerals. So it can be wood, it can be minerals and other key raw materials. Women, children, and even men have been raped in areas close to mining industries. It was the case near Mombasa, for instance, and recently we've tried to include in the analysis of the report, so in the situation analysis report, what was the situation on the ground. And we said clearly that the conflict was linked to the access to resources. In June, we published a document in which we stated clearly that the conflict was linked to areas where gold was mined on a small scale. So there's a clear link between the exploitation of natural resources and the situation of human rights. This is why it is necessary, as the Human Rights Council has been doing for a few years, to focus on human rights issues. And if you look at the Human Rights Council's resolutions, in the recital, you will notice that we take into account that the governance of the mining sector is one of the key sectors and one of the keys, one of the solutions to solve the situation we have in the DRC, especially when we look at the role and the consequences of the exploitation of natural resources in the multiplication of conflicts that can be generated by armed groups, but this can also be some community conflicts that we start noticing a bit everywhere.
À travers son comité de sanctions et le travail de collecte d'informations et d'analyse effectué par le groupe des experts.
We have different colleagues in charge of the analysis, and there we can have access to the information that could include sanctions on some stakeholders. These are sometimes close to the armed groups. They've been kidnapping children, there was sexual abuse linked to the conflict, but this is always taking place in a context of resource exploitation. But sometimes also we have to look into what some business stakeholders do, because these businesses enjoy the fruit of the mining activity through the supply chain, and somehow the group of experts is able to trace it back to them. So I think we should make more efforts so that the Human Rights Council digs more to impose those resolutions and work in line with this dynamic, which we've been highlighting now with the Security Council. So now there are specific resolutions on action when it comes to the technical assistance provided to Congo, DRC. There, clearly we support those efforts made by the government and the national institutions, generally speaking, like the parliament, so the civil society, but also other institutions that promote democracy. We push them into promoting all those matters, not only civil and political or civic and political matters. We need a general approach, and there more and more we see that poverty is a factor which worsens the whole situation in the DRC. And so to get more stability and to work better, we actually need to improve the situation of people who should fulfill their social and economic purposes or aims. So this requires better health, education, access to water, protection of the environment. Because these sectors are being impacted on many territories across the DRC. They're facing adverse consequences of the multinational companies sometimes, or just the consequences of illegal mining or artisanal mining activities. So there's a lot of things to do to make sure that we can have a budget which is taking into account human rights, which is boosting social economy. And I see that Emmanuel and others who spoke before actually, well, they actually explained how the mining sector can or does contribute to creating wealth at a national level. And in a country like the DRC, This is sometimes ununderstandable. So this shows it is highly necessary to improve the skills in the mining sector, especially governance on resources. And so this will allow the DRC to reduce poverty and to fully commit into the execution of a social and economic activity. So in concrete terms, what can we do? Well, since the end 2018, 2019, our commitment is that we are working to promote the main principles on to impose that on multinational companies. Want them to respect those principles. We work with AFREWATCH and other partners. We also try to do capacity building in the civil society. Civil society has made a situation analysis. We need to use those analyses. We need to work on accountability. We need to provide for the conditions for the state and its institutions to respect and fulfill their obligations and provide the services needed for the population, but they also set the necessary conditions for the population and the organizations that represent them to keep developing their own capacity and to make sure they can also claim their rights. So if we do so, it will help the local level. It will enable it to have more informed communities, people who are more aware, and who in turn will contribute to reports and assessment work done by companies. We all know that the multinational companies present in the DRC, they send yearly reports for the compliance framework. They send that to the New York UN headquarters and they say, this is how we behave from a social and environmental viewpoint. So these reports are important because civil society and associations should provide alternative information to show that sometimes the reports proposed by those companies do not correspond to reality whatsoever. So we see autochthonous peoples whose rights are completely denied, and then these people are forced to leave their natural areas and they end up somewhere else. We know, like it was said before by the previous speaker, there are many villages which are replaced somewhere else in different conditions that do not respect the previous one. So this is very problematic. So for us, it is important that we keep promoting and disseminating the main guidelines and principles on multinational corporate social responsibility. Also, we have those voluntary-based principles that should be agreed to. And the end goal is to implement what's been recommended. That's the creation of a forum. This forum will encompass all those subjects and gather these multinational companies and players around the same table with governments, national institutions, civil society representatives, and regardless of the sector, there could be other corporations or people around the table. So the purpose is to hold them accountable or for the current situation and for the distribution of resources in the region. We want to make sure that we can reduce as much or as far as we can the negative impact of those activities. Okay. So at the beginning of my presentation, I mentioned the necessary due diligence policy requested by the UN. It is today subject to a great reflection process, especially on the way how the due diligence policy should be implemented. This policy comes from the UN family that wanted a specific policy to respect human rights, but this should be extended to illegal usage of natural resources. So this requires monitoring work, human rights control work, and then they should commit to working with the national authorities and make sure that the civil society gets involved to provide information and improve respect of human rights in the DRC. So it's also about working on standards and norms. This is also part of what we need to do in the DRC. This is what we do there. We try to work with different parliamentary committees and other entities, some ministries, for example. And the end purpose is to improve the national law and make sure that the country will respect its commitments. Because all this has been ratified by the DRC. Sir, sorry to interrupt. We'll have to move on with other speakers and guests, but we could get back to this in the Q&A session if you agree. Thank you for this presentation anyway. Great presentation, which explained the negative impact of mining, impact for human rights in the Congo, among others, and the role of human rights stakeholders who need to inform and denounce what's going on some territories. So I'd like to thank you for that. Before we start the Q&A session, we also enjoyed today the expertise of two additional experts. They will share their views on what we've heard so far. So without further ado, we'll give the floor to Henri Nuat, the Secretary General of the Bishops' Commission for Natural Resources. They're in charge of working on innovative matters when it comes to the usage of natural resources. Sir, you have the floor.
Voilà, on vous entend maintenant. Merci.
Thank you. So I've paid great attention to what was said by the previous speakers. Now, in spite of all those negative things that we heard, Emmanuel said there was hope somehow. So let's be hopeful, because thanks to this process, we've had some results. This enables us to become more aware of the situation. And so I think we can move forward, because today's reflection will actually enable us to do better. So also heard that they spoke about local development. And by doing so, local development can be economic, it can be social. I would like the speakers to speak about the environment, because I do believe that the environment is also part of local development. Then we spoke about the obligations of local development. And then I said to myself that maybe we should make a difference between the existing obligations in the mining code on local development by the industry or for artisanal people or workers. So we carried out analysis work recently, and we see that when it comes to the ores like copper, cobalt, casterite, diamonds, if you take these sectors or subsectors, there's always people working like individuals or artisans, so single workers. And we see that this production is higher than the industrial production when you put all artisanal workers together. If you look at their obligations, they have different obligations. Now, if you work on copper or cobalt, you could understand that the companies in the sector and the DRC pay a mining fee. They pay 0.3%, which is not done by artisanal workers and miners. And the latter are stakeholders. And maybe the treatment entity is the one that should be more involved, because they're exporting. There should be the fee maybe. But the fee is lower if you compare with the contribution for local development in South Kivu, for example. Now, except from this, the final users are not in the country. For them, there is no responsibility whatsoever when it comes to local development, so we should think about that. Now, in addition to this, you have the traceability mechanism. This is something we've not mentioned enough. These traceability mechanisms, well, I believe should be managed as follows. We know how things happen, and it has an impact on the population as a whole, even artisanal workers. It's even more complex for gold. We don't know how to trace back gold so far. Now there are different initiatives on cobalt. So should we do something there? Should we support existing mechanisms foreseen by the law to avoid that we increase the burden on those people or have a de facto embargo? It's not really an embargo because this ore is always reaching the final users anyway by a different channel. So let's keep that in mind. Now, all this is taking place in the general governance framework of the country, in the management of poverty. When it comes to governance, we have a decentralization process, which is not completed. So if you propose working with the local committees, when you should know that these are proposed in the decentralization process, which is not completed. When it comes to general poverty level, we could ask ourselves a question. We have those mining areas which enjoy that money. Then we have a law on the sharing of resources, and it's not implemented or executed. Now add COVID to this. And because of COVID, we had an 11 billion budget. Now we'll never reach 11 billion. So there was something proposed by the members of parliament with that respect. So generally speaking, this is my assessment of the situation. But if you demand traceability mechanisms, what happens? Previous speaker spoke about conflicts from the northeast to the southwest. And this is where you have conflicts. This is where there's ore. This is where money is packed. So we need to trace this back, trace the ore, but can we trace the weapons also? Because weapons are used and sold there. We should also trace financial flows, which are not appearing in the banks, especially not the banks of the DRC. So that's necessary. So we celebrated the World Day of Peace, and people asked questions to the United Nations and the mission in the Congo. They said, what is peace? What's peace? And because ore is still being extracted and is not covered by the law. So we saw what happened at the barrier in Goma. So artisanal workers were working in spite of COVID. How did we export the ore? So that's problematic. So to cut a long story short, I will say that we need to see what we need to do. Now we have, it's all about governance, and it's all about the lack of responsibility at international, regional, and local level. We have Dr. Kweke. He was threatened because he spoke about troubling issues. So this is what we said, and these are the challenges nationwide, but also in the regions. Let's not forget about the international level, which is also facing challenges when it comes to the revision of the code. Well, Mr. Mouya, thank you for your comments. Thank you for this, because it tells us more about the work that remains to be done to improve the working of the mining sector and transparency in the DRC, especially when it comes to artisanal mining and traceability. We'll now give the floor to a second guest who will give his views on what's going on the field. Mr. Amsati of the first advisor of COPAVI, which is a mining cooperative of artisanal diggers on the Walikale territory in North Kivu. What will be your contribution to the current discussion? Sir, you have the floor.
There you have the floor. We should be able to hear you. Yes, thank you very much. Can you hear me? Yes? So I'm Idrissa Hassani, VP for the COCABI. All right. Can you hear me? Yes? Can you? Yes, we hear you. Go on. Thank you very much. So as I was saying, I am a head of a cooperative of artisanal miners next to Walikali. We regret to see that many people talked about traceability, human rights, and we want to talk about human rights, obviously, but we are marginalized. Our rights are violated by mining companies. This is why we consider there are like two laws. If artisanal miners were doing exactly the same as alpha min and large-scale mining industry, we would be put in prison. They would say these are conflict minerals and so on. In 2017, we've been manipulated. We've been chased away like dogs. Our rights have been severely violated. Companies have used the military to steal us from our goods, from our properties. Minerals have been stolen. We deeply regret that situation. This is what we would like to talk about today, because we feel like there are double standards when it comes to the enforcement of the law. And there's a major conflict between the company Alphamin and small-scale miners like us. Thank you. Thank you very much for that remark. Numerous information have been shared by the different speakers, and I'd like to thank them all for taking part in this side event. I'd like to thank all the participants for all those very relevant questions and comments. We received a lot of questions. We can see that you are really interested in that topic. Unfortunately, given that we are lacking time, we won't have a chance to answer all the questions. We try to group up some questions and we'll try to answer as many questions as possible. If you still have questions at the end of this webinar, feel free to reach out to us and we'll try to answer them. We received a lot of questions about the EU legislation. What is the relevance of the regulation of EU on traceability of minerals, and what about the list of countries that is included in the new regulation? Maybe one of the panelists would like to answer that first question on the EU legislation. What is the relevance of the enforcement regulation of the EU and the list of countries that has been included? Anyone would like to take the floor in order to answer that question? Yes, you have the floor. Yes, thank you very much. I think that the EU regulation is key to foster traceability of minerals coming from high-risk areas and conflict zones. All importers based in the EU will have to respect that regulation. They will have to prove that the minerals they import within the EU have been exploited in conditions that do not violate the human rights. This is an added value, and it is very important for the DRC, given that it is about gold, cassiterite, and coltan. And it is important because in DRC, these are the minerals that bring problems. What is happening in the eastern area of Congo is about those minerals, and I do believe that this EU regulation will strengthen the current tools. So this is an extra tool that will support and strengthen the local regulations. Regarding the list of countries that will be included, I got no information on the countries that will be included in the list, but I know that DRC is part of the countries that will be included in that regulation. We have a partnership, a European partnership for responsible minerals. Some activities have already been implemented. Some assistance has been given to the DRC in order to prepare the implementation of this regulation, so DRC will be included. In the meantime, I think that there are some limitations or concerns that we've always expressed as part of the civil society. Indeed, this regulation limits itself only to direct importation of minerals from Congo or from other countries to the EU. However, the regulation does not take into account other aspects, such as minerals leaving Congo, going to Dubai, going to Asian countries, and then there are some semi-finished products that go to Europe. So we are wondering if it wouldn't be possible to include transit countries as well, because a lot of Asian countries import minerals from Congo, and you also have Tanzania, Rwanda, and other neighboring countries that are importing the minerals, and then they are sent to Asian countries or to Dubai and so on, and they are considered as minerals free from conflict. Well, they come from Eastern Congo, so we are trying to improve traceability of those minerals, and we would like to make this regulation, EU regulation, more complete. This is what I can say about it. And we have a colleague who's part of this seminar, is not one of the speakers, but maybe he could give more answers to that question. Well, thank you very much, but I think we'll go to another question. You brought quite a comprehensive answer to that question, so thank you very much. We had another question regarding COVID-19. After COVID-19, do we think there will be an impact on the budget of the of Congo? Will there be an impact on the Congolese budget given the drop of revenues in the mining industry? Well, my answer would be yes. COVID-19 will certainly have an impact on the state budget, on the national budget. And COVID-19 will have an impact on small-scale mining as well. Indeed, during the state of emergency, nearly all the activities were stopped. So there was no small-scale mining. You know, Ministry of Finance publishes the revenues, the taxes it got. It does it every month. And based on those reports, we note that the budget is lower. In the draft budget, we were expecting $11 billion. In 2019, we didn't reach 3 billion. Now we had the COVID-19 crisis, so we don't see how we could get that money. With that, we will reach a budget of $11 billion. Then, when I took the floor, I told you about the price of metals and minerals. It is quite low. Therefore, based on the current situation, I doubt we will reach $11 billion. Diane, there was another very important question in the chat regarding the label conflict minerals. And I'd like to answer that question. Yes, we'll try to answer it in a few minutes. We are past 2:30 p.m., but we'll take a few extra questions. Maybe I'll change slightly the order of questions, or maybe Laurence could go on with a question for Sister Célestine. Laurence? Yes, good afternoon. We are Laurence and Michael. We will try to be as brief as possible while giving the floor to the speakers in order to answer a few of the questions we've received. So, a question for Sister Célestine. Could you briefly tell us about the working conditions and safety on semi-industrial sites? And is it a model that could be interesting for communities, cooperatives, and large industrial groups? So this is the first question for Sister Célestine. And then we had another question for Abdoul Aziz. Do you think that another UN binding instrument on the responsibility of multinationals would have an impact on the mining industry in the DRC? Well, let's start with those two questions and then we will conclude. Sister Célestine, you have the floor. Yes, thank you very much, Laurence. Thank you for the question. So the question is about working conditions in semi-industrial sites. Can we improve the working conditions? Well, it depends. In our province, for instance, we are taking action to improve the working conditions in semi-industrial sites. Often, people are working in dredgers. They are working in water. And I do not think that those conditions are the ones we want to make it a model. This is not a model of working conditions. Other operators use crushers, and there are no measures aiming at protecting the operators. To make it a model, I do believe that assistance services look at that issue. Some assistance services should help people working in the semi-industrial sites to work in safer conditions. It is only if we improve safety and if we set rules on the way they have to operate that we could say that we have a good model when it comes to working conditions. The working conditions at the moment are risky. Moreover, operators need appropriate means to do better than artisanal miners. If it is well done, we can support such semi-industrial sites, but at the moment, we cannot encourage such practices. Those practices are not safe, and they need to be framed in order to improve the working conditions. Yes, thank you. Thank you for the question about a future potential UN binding instrument. Such a binding instrument could be beneficial for the governance of the mining industry in the DRC. As I said, we had a report from an expert group. They identified in that report what were the drivers of conflict in the DRC. They identified what were the problems in the supply chain until Dubai. So they spotted that the supply chain was going to Dubai. And they checked the supply chain in Dubai itself. They drafted a report and identified the responsibility and accountability of neighboring countries as well. This has been identified, and those reports have been sent to the Security Council. I know that talks are underway in order to have a conventional instrument when it comes to the responsibility of multinationals, when it comes to the respect of human rights. It is all about advocacy, and I think that civil society organizations must be better informed about the current situation and must work on advocacy. This is key to share information in order to improve the situation on the ground. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. One last question for Gilbert Dhego. Beyond the lack of knowledge on the mining code, isn't there a lack of will to respect and enforce the mining code from the Congolese government and foreign companies? Well, before Gilbert takes the floor, I wanted to say that we received a huge amount of questions and comments. We are thrilled because we see you are truly interested in that topic. So thank you very much for those questions. Unfortunately, we can only take a couple of questions, but for your information in the chat, we wrote down our emails. So feel free to send us a mail. We'll send you a short report and we'll try to answer your questions. So Gilbert, you have the floor and then we'll conclude. Thank you very much for that question. As you know, law is tough, but the law has to be respected. We all have to abide by the law. When the law says that some people cannot be elected for mining activities, it does not help us. Some state authorities were used to benefit from mining activities. But when the law prevents them from benefiting from mining activities, obviously they are not happy. They are unhappy. So in a way, there's some will that must be shown by the state. The state must show that it wants the law to be enforced and respected. On the other hand, there are people that don't want to apply the law. And if they are not forced to respect the law, they won't. Yet some organizations and even some authorities that were part of mining activities, they were benefiting from mining activities, and now they cannot do it anymore. This is a new situation, obviously, and the law has simply to be enforced. This is tough law, but it needs to be applied. If it's not enforced, people that want to go around the law will do so. That's all.
Merci Gilbert pour cette réponse. Et nous vous remercions.
Thank you, Gilbert, for this reply. I would like to thank you, everyone, for being there today. I would like to thank you for your involvement in the talks. And we're just a little late, but we'd like to apologize for that. But we're very happy that you were very interested. We'd like to thank also the 5 panelists who have shared their experience and expertise with us today. And we also hope you've enjoyed this meeting and it was interesting for you. As said before, Mrs. Laurence Platmer and Mr. Miguel Desplein are on the chat box. If you want to, Mr. Replin is on the chat box. You can contact him too. Okay, thank you everyone again and have a nice afternoon. Thank you also from the interpreters. Have a great day, everyone. Bye-bye.